We'll get underway and see where we go with this. I have also got, for those who like to see stuff or want to scribble notes, I do have some paper versions of the presentation. All right, so we're going to use this morning to do some thinking about the Gospel of Matthew, because this is the liturgical year or the church year where Matthew is kind of our controlling Gospel for the year. Before we do that, let me just, go back. I want to show you something. This hasn't yet been released, but for us to be really using, but I'm just being a little bit cheeky. That's the new Cathedral logo, which we'll be seeing a lot more of in weeks and months to come. We've done a bit of a refresh of the branding. So let's Matthew among the Gospels, or getting ready for a year of Matthew. So we have a 3-year lectionary cycle. That means that, because the word lectionary can mean a number of different things. In this case, it means a set of readings, basically. Sometimes it means the book, which has the readings in it, but in this context, we're talking about just a list of readings that are chosen to be read on particular Sundays or feast days, or there's even a weekday lectionary. So a lectionary in this case means a set of readings, and one of the really great outcomes of the Second Vatican Council and of what's called the liturgical renewal movement, which was happening around the same time, is that all the main churches are using the same lectionary, which has never happened before. So for the last 25, 30 years or more, the Catholics, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, the Unitings and so on are all using the same set of readings basically every Sunday. So whether you go to St Mary's or here, you'll be basically, the faithful are engaging with the same serve of Scripture each week, which means it's much easier to have conversations like, so what did your priest do with that really wacky reading last Sunday, or whatever? You do that now because we're using the same readings, okay? Or because it's a wacky priest, yeah. So, so we've got a 3-year cycle. So basically we focus on what we call the synoptic Gospels. I'll talk about that shortly. So in year A, it's Matthew. This is year A, as it turns out. Year B, it's Mark. Year C, which we just finished before Advent, is of course the Gospel of Luke. And by doing this, instead of mashing it all together, we actually listen to the distinctive elements of each Gospel writer. Obviously, as we'll see, they're telling more or less the same story, but Matthew and Luke, along with Mark, who was probably written first, they each give things a little spin because of their audience, because of the theological perspective they're bringing to it. So this avoids the traditional pious thing of, in our heads, of mashing it all together into one story. A classic example of that, apart from the Christmas nativity play, where you put Matthew and Luke together, because you want to have the shepherds and you want to have the wise men, okay, never mind what the Bible says, is the story of Jesus and the rich young ruler. Okay, he's rich. That guy is rich in all 3 Gospels. He's a ruler in Luke, and he's a young man in Matthew. So he becomes the rich young ruler, because that's how the Sunday school teacher talked to us about that story, or the RE teacher talked to us about the story. So we have this 3-year cycle. I've just said some of this: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, sorry. John, of course, doesn't fit into the 3-year cycle. John gets a fair bit of a use during Lent and Easter. So every year we give Luke extra time on the weeks either side of Easter. So that's where John has his moment in the sun. So this is the year when we're going to focus on the way Matthew tells the Jesus story. Okay. So one way to get inside this is to think about, which bits of Matthew are we not going to hear this year? So this slide and the next slide, okay, are all the bits of Matthew which are not going to be heard in church, even though it's the year of Matthew. Okay? And the bits that are read still are bits we're not going to hear, but they're bits which we only find in Matthew. And we're still not going to hear them in church as part of the lectionary. Okay? Now, does that raise any questions or tickle your sort of mind in any way? Are you curious about why that would happen?
How do you come?
Sorry?
Sorry, I was just going to say, how do you come to the parts that you're going to omit?
Oh, well, that's in practical terms, the list just doesn't include those. So when you look down the list, you might be reading, say one Sunday, you might be reading from Matthew chapter 4, and theoretically, the next Sunday you might be halfway through chapter 5 or even chapter 6, and they've just skipped a chunk. It's not normally that obvious, but sometimes it is. Yeah. So part of it you don't even know. You just come to church. It's what the reading is today. It's in the pew sheet. I mean, it must be the right reading, hopefully. Okay. So there's a whole lot of stuff that isn't read even when it's the year of Matthew. I think I've got a slide coming up about that. There are only 52 Sundays in the year. Okay, and we're going to see in a moment that there are more than 350 scenes in Matthew and Luke, which are rather longer than Mark. So you can't even say we'll do one scene each Sunday. No, that's not going to work. So there has to be selection. A lot of Matthew is identical with Luke. So if we're going to read it in year C, or vice versa, we don't read it in year A. But there is stuff which is only found in Matthew, and it still doesn't get a run in church on a Sunday during the year of Matthew. Okay? Sometimes it's because the committee thought, nobody really wants to hear that, or there's just a little bit something odd about it, or they just didn't think it was worth taking the time to listen to. Okay? Committee 1, Bible nil, or Matthew nil. Okay? Matthew thought it was worth saying. The committee's gone, no, not really. Okay? So, there are choices because there are only 52 Sundays. It does mean that we actually are not going to really hear Matthew. We're hearing Matthew through the lens of the lectionary committee, which have decided which verses are suitable for modern people to hear. Okay? To some extent, that can mean that the gospel is being domesticated, because there's a rawness to the gospel sometimes, and if the committee thinks that's not really suitable for reading out in church, then the gospel is being sandpapered to make it nice and smooth, so everything just flows. So one of the strategies, I know I do this when I'm preaching. If I'm getting a sermon ready, and I notice that we might read chapter 13, verses 1 to 4, and then verses 8 to 10. I'll go and look and see what's in verses 5, 6, and 7 to see whether I might choose to put it back in that Sunday, or at least refer to it.
Well, I do the same, and I read sometimes the bit before, so to tell a little bit of the story before the actual reading, so we put it into context and let people know that these other things happen too, and anybody that's listening will probably go and look at their Bible and have another look. Yeah. Hopefully.
Yeah, and the other thing people can do is, it's a good exercise actually, because we use the Gospels as lectionary excerpts, we never actually hear the Gospel from start to finish, as a performance, as one story, as it was meant to be heard. Remember, these documents, while they were written, they were originally people knew that when they pulled this together, they weren't going to have an audience sitting there with handouts or a projector. They were going to be listening to the performance, and they were going to hear the whole thing in one go, most likely. Okay? So one of the things we can do is actually, as a personal discipline, just actually sit down beginning of Lent or sometime like that and read the whole of Matthew. It takes about an hour and a half, 2 hours. You can read the whole of Matthew to yourself. It's even better if you can read it out loud, because that makes it hits you better if you've done it out loud. So that's what I've just been talking about, some of the strategies we can deploy. The people preparing the liturgy, the person who's preparing the sermon, and just in our own right anyway, we can go digging and make sure we are keeping up with the whole of Matthew. And if it is a story that we think we know that story from Mark or from Luke, it's still worth comparing it. Like, example, the rich young ruler. What I like to call it the story of the man with money, the story of the rich man, basically. If you look at how each of those Gospels use that story, it's obviously the same event, but Matthew and Luke treat it a bit differently from Mark. Okay. All right. So we're going to spend a year listening with Matthew. We've just come out of a year where we've been listening particularly to Luke. And this is a quote from the New Interpreter's Bible, for what it's, as it happens, just to say where it's coming from before it pops up. If we're really going to understand a gospel, really a gospel we're reading, we need to think about where it fits in amongst the other gospels. We need to recognise that gospel's distinctive structure, and we need to be aware or sensitive to its particular way it likes to talk about Jesus, which here is called dominant Christological emphases. But how does it like to talk about Jesus? Okay. So, for example, in Mark, Jesus is the action man. He's like Moses and Elijah rolled up into one package and set rolling down the hill. In Luke, Jesus is like a sort of prophet who's come to announce good news to the rich and the powerful. In Matthew, Jesus is like a Jewish teacher, Jewish rabbi. So you've got a slightly different kind of nuanced picture in each case. And pay attention to its themes. And so that's literally what we're going to do in the next 45 minutes or so. Okay, so let's have a look at the Gospels to start with. That's an icon from a mosaic in an ancient Byzantine church in Ravenna. And you see it's actually a sort of gospel, it's a little bookcase with the books of the Gospels. Because up until the printing press, to have a Bible, the complete Bible in one volume, was a major production task. There were such Bibles, but they were very few and far between. Mostly what you had a book of the Psalms. You had lectionary books, which were the bits you're going to read in church. So you have a book of the Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Mark, etc. So here's a picture from the roof of a church, and there's a cabinet. In the cabinet, we've got Marcus, Lucas, Matthias, Johannes. Mark, Luke, Matthew, John. So maybe it's meant to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, depending how they had the things organised on the shelf. So it's interesting the impression. So the first question is, how many Gospels are there? And we know how many Gospels are in the New Testament, correct? 4, right? 4? No, 4. Okay, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. But there are a lot more Gospels than that. So it's one level you can say, well, there's only one Gospel. That's the message about Jesus. That's true, but it's not the right answer, of course. The other issue is the 4 canonical Gospels that are in the New Testament. Some people have heard about the Gospel of Thomas. They go, oh, but there's 5. A few years ago, we had the Gospel of Judas. There's a lot of media attention around that and so on. Some people have said, is it 22, whatever. It's actually a huge number, and we're not going to even try to go through this. But if you went down the list, there are lots of Gospels. Gospel, 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 and so on. So there's a lot of documents which have the generic category of Gospel, written in the first 200 or 300 years after Jesus. 4 of them made the cut to get into the New Testament. Okay? For really good reasons. There are 4 corners in the world, and the Gospel's gone to all 4 corners of the world, so there can only be 4 Gospels. Okay? It's not a logic puzzle, is it? It's just it's a rationale, it's an excuse for what they wanted to do anyway. So these Gospels, just quickly, they come into various kind of subcategories. There's a whole lot of Gospels that don't tell any stories about Jesus doing stuff. They just collect the teachings of Jesus or the sayings of Jesus. These are called sayings Gospels. Actually, the most important one is the first one, what we call Q, because that was used by both Luke and Matthew. It's one of their sources. Okay, it's been lost, but that's where it's left its footprint. The other famous one, of course, is the Gospel of Thomas. Then we have Gospels that actually tell a story, and of course 4 of those are in the New Testament, and the only ones that made it into the New Testament are the ones that tell a story: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. There are infancy Gospels, Gospels that only talk about the baby Jesus. Actually, they're pretty weird, but they're kind of interesting to read. It's full of miracles. This is folklore in the 2nd and 3rd century, imaginary legends about, Jesus' first day at school. Imagine yourself as the school teacher. Jesus turns up for the first day at Seabass, and the teacher says, "What's your name, lad?" And he says, "I'll tell you that when you tell me who was before I am." You go, "Oh, smart Alec, all right, we know where to put you in the class," except he strikes the teacher dead. So this is kind of, we recognise straight away that's legend. This is not Jesus, okay? Then we have Gospels of which we only have a fragment. So we don't have the complete document. And there's another, 6 or 7 Gospels that we can tell they're part of a book which we don't know from anywhere else. So we give it a name, we've got to guess at what it might be, and we hope some more fragments might turn up at another time. And then there were Gospels which were written particularly for a Jewish audience, 3 that have survived, apart from Matthew: the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Ebionites, the Gospel of the Nazarenes. Okay, so there's 22, 24 Gospels that we know of, that we actually have copies of at least a portion. There are others that are mentioned in the writings of the early church fathers, but they were pretty good at destroying documents that they didn't want to survive. So they'll talk about this terrible book, but they've burnt it and they've destroyed all the copies. So we know there were more, but we don't necessarily know what was in them. Okay, so in other words, Matthew, like Mark and Luke, Matthew is an example of a particular type of literature which was very popular in the early church, in the 2nd and 3rd century in particular, and which of course is focused on Jesus, what he did, what he said, the Gospels. Okay, so then the next question is kind of, so what evidence do we have, or we have in our Bibles now as the Gospel of Matthew? When is the earliest evidence for that book existing and for the contents of the book? Okay, so this is the evidence from the papyrus and from the early codices. So this is the fairly complete list of the gospel fragments from the first couple of 100 years, and obviously we've got similar material for the letters and for the book of Acts and for the book of Revelation. I'm just focusing on manuscript evidence for the Gospels. Okay, so P52 dates from around 100. That means sort of the P, of course, refers to papyrus. Papyrus 52 dates on the basis of handwriting and so on to about 125, so about 100 years after Easter. And it's a tiny fragment of John's Gospel, about this big, and it's written on both sides. So it's actually 2 paragraphs out of John chapter 18. Okay, but it doesn't occur, that's it. So that's the earliest little fragment of any of the Gospels. It's actually the Gospel of John. Then we have a fragment from the Gospel of Peter, possibly. Another fragment from the Gospel of John. Don't need to worry about Acts, except that Acts is the second half of Luke. That's why I left it in there. Then we get more Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of John, and we do get the letters of Paul, one particular codex. Finally, Papyrus 64 and 67, we get a couple of fragments from the Gospel of Matthew, okay, around about 200. And then P45, we actually have all 4 Gospels plus the book of Acts in one handy volume, obviously for using in church or something like that. Okay, so somewhere between 200 and 250, we can be pretty confident that this, something like Matthew's Gospel, was actually circulating. But there are other fragments for other Gospels that are actually also attested equally as early. Again, if we look at it, if we just focus in down on some of these, we've got, that's the same one I just mentioned, and that's the, so now we're going from papyrus to a codex. A codex is a book. Okay, a papyrus is a sheet. Okay, a codex means you've gone from the scroll to a book. So we've already, sorry, we just bumped something. So we've already seen that character. That's P45. Then we say, what if there are books, volumes that have in them different sets of the Gospels? Well, when it's a codex with just one book in it, John's Gospel is slightly more popular. Matthew, there are 14 examples from kind of the ancient church, 14 copies of Matthew. You come down to Luke, it's 7. Come down to Mark, it's 1. It'll be that one we saw before, P45. No, sorry, single book. So it's just one copy of Mark circulated by itself. So John and Matthew were way more popular than Luke and Mark in terms of what would sell in the cathedral bookshop. Okay. Similarly, there were volumes that had 2 books in them. We've got 2 copies of Luke and John, we found, ancient copies, and we've got 1 copy that has Matthew and John, one that has Matthew and Acts and so on. So, yeah, these are just the chance data because of what has survived. Mostly what has survived in Egypt, because the weather in Egypt is so dry that the papyrus documents didn't rot. So almost our entire sample is from Egypt rather than from Greece or Rome or Syria or Spain. Okay? And that's the same one we saw before, as Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts, the Chester Beatty Gospel books. So Matthew is around. We can find ancient copies, none of them older than about 200 CE. And I'm not really talking about the date of Matthew, but most people would date Matthew to about 85. I think that we'd be much better to date Matthew about 110, 115, something like that. So there's almost 100 years goes by until we actually have copies of that book. So, summing that up, Matthew's attested from the early 200s, which means 3rd century. It's just as popular as John was. It's way more popular than Mark or Luke. So that's interesting. I mean, Matthew is very Jewish, but is also more slanted towards the life of the church. So maybe that's why it was more popular than either Luke or Mark. It's easy to see why you choose Matthew over Mark, because everything in Mark is also found in Matthew, okay, with maybe 1 paragraph difference. So we get a sense that there's no question that the Gospel of Matthew, in the form that we know it, was certainly in circulation by 200, and somewhere in the previous 100 years was put together, probably towards the beginning of that period. The next bit I just want to touch on briefly, you'll have it there on your handouts if you want to look at it more closely later on. I just want to throw up onto the screen some of the basic bits of data about how the Gospels compare with each other. So the first thing is just to look at the shape of the story. When we say that Matthew, Mark and Luke are the synoptic Gospels, which means you can look at them together, sun and optic, so you can look at them together, you put them side by side, and they have They have exactly the same structure. Notice though that both Matthew and Luke elaborate and they give Jesus a big sermon, a big teaching moment while he's in the Galilee, which you don't find in Mark. That's what we call the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel. Okay? And it's chapter 5, 6 and 7. So but it's still following the same thing. Jesus is up in Galilee teaching the crowds, but Matthew and Luke both dump in a whole extended chunk of Jesus' teaching. His prophetic mission, going around doing stuff, using parables, questions being asked about who is this guy. Jesus then making his one and only journey to Jerusalem in the Synoptic Gospels. Okay? Whereas in John, he's ducking down to Jerusalem all the time. That's one of the differences. Okay? They all tell a story of basically Jesus doing some stuff in Jerusalem and especially focusing on the last few days of his life. And then they all have some kind of stories about the resurrection. Okay? So that's why we can take year A, year B, year C, because they're all going to basically follow the same track. Okay. In terms of length, just a quick heads up, Matthew has just over 1,000 verses, Mark has 660 verses, Luke has almost 1,100 verses. That's just a rough measure. Obviously verses are longer and shorter, but that's sort of consistent with that. What's more interesting in a way is that Matthew has 117 scenes, and told you the wrong number before. Mark has 95, Luke has 120. So you're beginning to see that Matthew and Luke, they might have some different scenes, they're working with roughly the same set of data. But Matthew has a lot more teaching material, Mark has hardly any, and Luke has a pretty good bit, but not as good as Matthew. Okay? So this is just talking about how much word count, if you like, how much space they give to their different stuff. I don't want to spend too much time on this. It's just looking at the content which is the same in each combination of the Gospels. When you put Matthew, Mark and Luke together, this is the stuff which is the same. When you just put Matthew and Mark together, you have this much which is the same. When you put Mark and Luke together, and so on. Okay? So it's just showing there are patterns of agreement between the different Gospels. If these were students handing in an essay in the School of Theology, I would be suspecting plagiarism. Okay? Because there are patterns of kind of dependence and influence here, which would not be acceptable in our culture. Similarly, there are things a whole lot of stuff which Luke chooses not to do. One of Luke's things is he wants to be efficient. He's only got this much space in a scroll. So one of the things Luke does is he abbreviates stories, and if he thinks there's a duplication, he leaves it out. Okay? So Matthew and Mark both have 2 stories of the feeding of the 5,000. Luke has 1. He's already told you that story. I'm not going to tell it to you a second time. So Luke has left lots of stuff out. Mark obviously leaves lots of stuff out. He's a much shorter book, so there's just not much content and so on. Okay. So again, we see some patterns of what gets in, what gets left out. What's unique? So in Matthew, there are 35 scenes which are unique to Matthew. Won't find them in Mark, won't find them in Luke. Okay. But Luke himself has 48 scenes which are unique. So where did that stuff come from? They didn't get it from Mark. They didn't get it from the other guy. They haven't copied it from Q, because otherwise it would be common material. So where does the stuff which is only found in Matthew, where did that come from? And is that the stuff we should be focusing on if we really want to see what's making Matthew tick? The stuff that he's either chosen to leave out, or the stuff that he's put in that nobody else has. Okay? All right. So when we start mashing all that together and start comparing the Gospels, particularly like Matthew, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and so on, we can see some patterns. Matthew and Mark together, and Mark and Luke together, have about twice as much agreement, 100% more agreement, than if you take all three Gospels as a set. So something's going on there. As soon as you add either Matthew or Luke into this picture, you start to get differences. That's what this is saying. Matthew and Luke do not agree with each other, except where they copy directly from Mark, which is why they're going to the headmaster's office. Okay? The only time those two guys agree with each other, Mark's already said it first. So clearly, they've got access to a copy of Mark. So that's that point. When we look at, keep looking at how they sequence their material, the only time Matthew and Luke agree about the ordering of material is when they're agreeing with Mark's sequence of material. Okay? You can see what the Dean of Students is beginning to get ready to say. So, but the other thing is, Matthew and Luke have about 75 sayings of Jesus which are not found in Mark, but they are found in Matthew and Luke. And that's basically what we call Q. And just comes from the German word Quelle, meaning source. There's a mysterious source which Matthew and Luke appear to have used at some point in their formation. And Mark didn't have access to it.
Do academics speculate where that source came from?
Q. Oh, there are numerous PhDs done speculating exactly that question.
Anything that's really high profile that kind of sits there that's fairly dominant?
I'll talk about it in a second, but the brief summary would be that they talk about there's a Q community. Okay, so Q is a document which does not exist. It's a hypothetical document based on common material in two documents that do exist. We don't have a copy of Q as far as we know. Okay, but there's a reasonable argument that these two guys clearly, it's word for word the same. It had to come from somewhere by one copying each other, or they both drew on another source. And most scholars have gone for that option. So then they say, okay, well, the people who made the Q document are the Q community. This would be news to them. They would never have called themselves in the first century, we are the Q people, we are the Q community. But that's the scholarly thing that we've created to study them. What they're talking about is the people who actually knew Jesus in Galilee, what happened to them after Easter? Because Paul never went there. Okay. According to Luke, the gospel headed off towards Rome, and there's never a mention of Galilee ever again in the book of Acts. Never crops up. No mention of it. But there were people back in Galilee, around Capernaum and Nazareth and Bethsaida and what have you, and Tiberias, who actually were the people Jesus hung out with for however long his public activity lasted. Okay. And we call that group of people the sort of Q community or the Jesus movement. And the theory is that the Q material is basically the standard spiel. We call it sermons, but let's use a non-religious. It's the standard kind of talking points that the Jesus people in Galilee used when they went to a synagogue and tried to remind people about Jesus and get them to become part of the Jesus movement. And that's where a lot of the sayings of Jesus were preserved. And then later on, that collection, which appears to be written, because it's literally word for word down to the exact part of speech and down to questions of case ending. It's absolutely the same. But it's also in Greek, not in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. So we're talking about a Greek-speaking Jesus movement in the Galilee who first gather up as part of their failed, as it turned out, missionary effort to make the Galilee Christian, okay? They actually generate this collection of Jesus material, which later on goes into the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. That's the most common scholarly explanation. Yep, and there'll be a chart in a moment that sort of says that, kind of. Okay. So when we look at style, Mark reads, it's not very polished. He starts almost every paragraph with "and immediately." And immediately they went there, and immediately he did that, immediately he did that. And it's really not very sophisticated. Mark's pretty basic kind of composition. Matthew tends to clean up the grammar. He creates nice literary transitions from one scene to the next. And basically, Matthew is a new, revised, enlarged edition of the Gospel of Mark. Luke does some of the same, but actually he's actually not all that good in his Greek, but it's the best Greek in the New Testament. Okay, even better than Paul. So Luke is writing from and for a slightly more sophisticated audience that don't drop their H's and don't add ing at the everything and all that sort of stuff. Okay, and yet, when they're doing the same passage, Luke is almost always more like Mark than he is like Matthew. So Mark is the influence over Luke, not Matthew. Okay? Again, you can see that, for example, in the story of the rich man. While Luke's transitions, he also creates little transitions, to get from one scene to the next, as Matthew has done. But Luke's transitions are always a little bit more sophisticated than the ones that we find in Matthew. And Luke is the master of the little kind of summary statement, which doesn't actually tell you anything that you could bank, but it gives you the impression that you know a whole lot of stuff. And he does that through the book of Acts as well. Okay? So they've got their own styles and so on. So what's coming out of all this is that Matthew, our gospel for this year, is one of several. Like Luke, Matthew shares some kind of literary relationship with Mark, and like all of the gospels that made it into the New Testament, Matthew is an example of a narrative gospel, although he has dumped into his narrative, which he got from Mark, he's dumped a whole lot of sayings gospel material from Q. So it's a kind of a hybrid gospel in a way. Unlike Luke, so what's going on here? Well, Matthew ends the story in chapter 28 with the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations. I'm with you always to the end of the world. But Luke doesn't stop there. Luke goes on with the book of Acts to tell the next part of the story. And whereas both John's Gospel and Luke's Gospel actually have a section, Luke it's at the beginning and John is at the end, they actually tell us why they've written this book. Matthew doesn't. It just kind of lands on your desk. Okay? He doesn't explain what he's doing. So we're going to have to read between the lines if we want to work out what Matthew's up to. So we've looked at we looked at the genre of Gospels and examples of Gospels from the early church. We've tried to place Matthew and so on in a context amongst those Gospels. We've looked at the data about where they overlap, where they differ, who's longer, who's shorter, who's using better Greek, who's using rougher Greek. One thing to notice is they are all written in Greek, not Latin and not Aramaic. If it had been either of the others, that would have told us something. If it had been written in Aramaic, that would have been grassroots Jewish village talk. Okay? If it had been written in Latin, well, that would have really gone over to the empire. Okay, that's very upper class. The fact that it's coiny Greek, everyday market Greek, not sophisticated Greek, just regular shopping Greek from the markets, says this is ordinary people they're most interested in communicating with other ordinary people. It's not a philosophical exercise. It's not a high sort of apologetic exercise. It's about, it's like using Facebook, okay, instead of some more formal channel of communication. So then we try and work out how the Gospels got written, and we've already, in a sense, had some of this discussion. So, I'm about to show you the most common theory, which that starts out with the Q Gospel, or the Q saying, source, whatever, written perhaps in the 60s. Gospel of Mark, written about 5 years or so after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Not really much of a connection between Q and Mark. Mark's really going in another direction. One of the things about Mark we could say is that Mark is trying to explain why Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans and Jesus didn't come back to save the city. That's a serious problem in the first century. After 2,000 years, we got used to the idea that Jesus didn't come back to save Jerusalem. But for the people living in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, and the war breaks out in 66, is this it? Is this when Jesus is coming back? Well, guess what? He didn't. And he still hasn't. Okay? He didn't come back for the Jews in Auschwitz, and he didn't come back for the Japanese as well in Hiroshima. So we've got to factor that hard reality into our theology. So Mark is not really dealing with the Galilee stuff. He's talking about what happens when an evil city falls under the judgment of God because they killed the prophet, they killed the Messiah. Matthew comes along a bit later, according to most scholars, and Matthew has taken Mark plus the Gospels, the Q material, to create his Gospel, and mysteriously, and most scholars would have this back up here on the timeline, Luke, quite independent of Matthew, Luke is doing the same thing. He's taken Mark, he's taken Luke, and he's created his account. And most scholars would say Matthew and Luke were written somewhere in the middle of the 80s. Why do they say that? Because we know nothing about the 80s in the first century. We know a bit about the 60s, that's when Paul is killed, and the other apostles. We know a bit about the 70s because of the destruction of Jerusalem, and we know a bit about the 90s and the early years of the second century. So they tend to say, well, these Gospels, we'll stick them in that spot, around about 85.
Who recorded the information in that time frame?
Right, so on this kind of explanation, the material that's in Q up here, that's been orally generated in the Galilee, like I was just saying, and it's created this oral. But then it turns into a written text, because when Matthew and Luke use it, they didn't use punctuation, but it's almost like saying even the commas are in the same space.
Written in the 115 year?
No. So this is back in the 60s. This is being put together as a document. In between 60 65, before the war is what they're saying. Okay, they're saying Mark is writing directly after the war. Okay, and so in this model, the destruction of Jerusalem is the big thing, and the Gospels are being written in response to that. So the traditional answer is Mark was Peter's secretary, and he wrote down whatever he listened to Peter talking to church groups, and he wrote down Peter's ideas, and he got them all jumbled up because he wasn't a very good secretary, and that's how we got the Gospel of Mark. That's what the early fathers said, because they really preferred Matthew, which was much more organised. Okay, so behind these two written documents, there has to be some oral tradition. Nobody is holding up a tape recorder to Jesus and giving it to their secretary to transcribe. It's oral performance, oral memory, oral repetition, and eventually it gets written down. And by the 60s, we're 30 years after Easter, and people are dying. And for most people in a third world country, including the first century, die around about 40 years of age. If you live to 40, you've done remarkably well. Okay, so because these are sort of peasants and workers, they have no health cover, no penicillin, It's like a third world village in Africa. If you live to be 40 or 50, you are the respected old man in the village. Okay? So there's going to be a huge wipeout of people that knew Jesus between 30 Easter time, 30 CE, and 60, 65. People who were in their 20s, are they still going to live another 30 years? Almost certainly not. Statistically, it's not going to happen. So that could have been why hey, old fellow, we've got to write this down, you know? Oh, we've got to write it down in Greek. In Greek, but we never spoke Greek around, but I know, but we've got to put it in Greek now, because that's what everybody else is reading, talking in. So the Jesus tradition jumps from being Aramaic to being Greek with the Q Gospel. And Mark follows suit. And later on, Matthew and Luke do as well. That's the most common explanation. It's called the four-source theory. Mark and Q, plus Matthew and Luke each had some other independent bits, which we call M and L. Okay, that's one theory. The other one is to say, no, there was no Q. Mark and Matthew and Luke just copy from each other. And the way that tends to look is something like this. Mark is the source for Matthew. Mark is also the source for Luke Acts. But Luke was aware of Matthew, copied from Matthew, and that's why there's some bits that are word for word the same. Okay. There are various reasons why that doesn't appear to work. Not least is that Matthew and Luke never agree on sequence or content, really, except for the Q material, unless they're copying from Mark. So why all of a sudden are we thinking that Luke is deriving his stuff from Matthew? So that's one explanation. A handful of really good scholars have been pushing this for years on the basis that let's go for the simplest possible explanation. No one's ever seen a copy of Q. No one's even ever mentioned a copy of Q until the 1930s. All right? So let's just give that away as a bad idea. The alternative, an alternative is this one, which just really flicks all that on its head. Still has Q, but now it's being called Proto-Luke. In other words, think of the Gospels as being like an archaeological tell. And at the bottom of the Luke tell, there's a layer of tradition, which is the material which other scholars call Q. So it's not another document, it's just the very first draft of Luke's Gospel. And it starts out way back up here. Mark comes along, same time, same place, doing the same stuff. And then Matthew's going to come on the scene, that's the guy we're interested in. But he's also aware of this early common saying material, which most scholars call Q, but which people like me are calling Proto-Luke. Actually, it's me copying other people. Okay? And if you go that way, then what you end up with is Luke Acts being written down here somewhere. As the direct descendant of Proto-Luke, just the final form of a project that started out in the Galilee way back in the 60s. Along the way, it's been influenced by Mark, and if you like, it's even been influenced a bit by Matthew. But there is no separate document called Q. Q is just stage one of the Gospel of Luke. Okay? So it's really playing with the same little bits of data and just trying to work out what's going on. What that says in overall is we don't know exactly what the process was, but Mark is critical to the process. There's another set of common material only found in Matthew and Luke. And we've got to come up with some explanation that makes sense of all that. Okay? And they're the three most common ones. Any other points for clarification there? That's a whole other talk sometime. Okay? So now comes to the question of how we read Matthew. So let's think about while we can see how this author goes about his task. And first off, we don't know his name. He probably wasn't called Matthew. called the Gospel of Matthew because Matthew was one of the 12 disciples, and the early church wanted every gospel in the 2nd century. They wanted every gospel to be connected with one of the apostles to give it authority. So this one gets given to Matthew. Okay, there's no reason for that. Just that's what happened. So we don't know don't know the name of the author or even the gender, but we assume he was probably a male. So he has a number of strategies. In the background, there's a narrator. Occasionally, there is stuff in the third person describing what's happening by this all-knowing, omniscient narrator. Okay, it's in the Gospels. Hardly ever steps onto the stage, but occasionally you catch a hint of his presence. Then there's the character of Jesus, who dominates the narrative, dominates the story, dominates the dialogue. Not many other voices are heard in Matthew's Gospel. A couple little ones here and there, but Jesus is the dominant voice coming through. The disciples are around Jesus and they're doing what they're asked to do. And unlike Mark, by the time we get to Matthew, the disciples are getting a nicer run. They're being treated with more respect. Jesus doesn't call them thickheads anymore, and so on, or similar kind of words, okay? So Matthew is showing a bit more respect for the 12 than Mark had done, which means there's some dynamics that change in the life of the church. Then there are other characters that come along. These are the people who come to Jesus for help, to have a demon cast out because they're blind, they want advice. You know, the rich young man who comes to Jesus in Matthew wants to know what he has to do to be saved. And Jesus' answer is very Jewish in Matthew. Keep the law. Keep the 10 Commandments. Paul said, you just failed. Okay, but very different theology. And then there are the opponents. And interesting, the only people that Jesus had trouble with in the Gospel of Matthew are Jewish people. Now, of course, Jesus is Jewish. All the disciples are Jewish. Okay, it's not like there were too many options in the story. But the Pharisees and the rulers and even the people as a whole are the opponents of Jesus. And that's probably reflecting the experience of the people for whom Matthew is writing the Gospel. That's what they were experiencing rather than what Jesus was experiencing. So we can see some of his strategies, drawing on a commentary by a guy called Lutz, that we can kind of work out the person Matthew hoped would read his book. So firstly, he's got to be literate enough, not so much to read the story, but to stick with the performance. You've got to be familiar with the genre. Like if you go to a concert, to an opera, to a show, you've got to know that you've got to stay the whole time and wait for the bit at the end and not leave halfway through, but you won't get the message kind of thing. Okay, particularly in Matthew, the message is in the final paragraph. They've got a good memory and they're able to link stories from other places. It's called intertextuality. For example, in the infancy stories, there's a guy called Joseph who has a dream. Haven't we heard that story before in the book of Exodus? Actually, sorry, the book of Genesis. Before you get to Exodus, there's a guy called Joseph who has dreams. Dreams about his brothers, dreams about his parents, dreams about Pharaoh when he's in prison. Joseph, dreamer. Okay, Matthew wants people to make connections, intertextual connections. This is another guy like Moses that I'm about to tell you about. They need to be literate and familiar with, and LXX is just a code for the Greek version of the Old Testament. Okay. Again, although he's very Jewish, Matthew is written by and for somebody in the Greek-speaking Jewish Christian community. And that Greek Bible is called the Septuagint, which means 70 old blokes. Okay? Because the legend was, there are two versions of the legend. If you're going to translate the Bible from Hebrew to Greek, how do you know that the Greek one is still kosher, inspired? Well, you have a legend. And in the legend, there were 70 elders commissioned by the king to translate the Bible from Hebrew into Greek. They were locked away in 70 separate rooms for 40 days and 40 nights, beginning to sound familiar. At the end of the 40 days and 40 nights, they were let out of their motel room and they put all their personally generated translations of the Bible on the desk, and they were word for word the same. It's a miracle. The Greek Bible is as good as the Hebrew Bible, and you don't need to learn Hebrew anymore. That's what the Jewish Greek-speaking community was telling each other. So we call it the Septuagint, and of course LXX is other Roman numerals for 70 old blokes. That's the story of the Greek Bible. And so Matthew's people are Septuagint people. They're not Hebrew-speaking Jews. But they know the history of Israel, and Matthew is constantly putting Jesus into the context of the history of Israel. And they know already the Jesus traditions because they've probably been reading Mark's Gospel. Okay? So Matthew is able to abbreviate some of his stories, or even just say, you know the story about, and then he goes on to something else. So he's able to assume they already know what he's talking about. And of course, as I've just said, for sure they're familiar with Mark because that's the basis of Matthew's story. These are people who participate in Christian worship, probably in Antioch, in what today is southern Turkey, but in those days was northwestern Syria. A cosmopolitan trading city. Remember, it's the place where Paul started his missionary journeys. He went out from the church at Antioch. That's probably the town where Matthew's gospel is targeted. Okay, these are people who accept Jesus as their Lord and as the ultimate teacher of Torah, because they are Jewish by background, Greek-speaking, open, inclusive Jewish. They're familiar with rabbinic practices, but they're critical of them. Certainly, Jesus in Matthew is very critical. Their primary language was Greek, which hooks back into the Septuagint stuff, and they're primarily ordinary church members, not bishops, not church leaders. Okay? And almost certainly males are in his audience, and probably fairly affluent males. Okay? So that's the kind of community. Actually, it sounds a bit like Cathedral in Grafton. Respectable people, pretty comfortable, well educated, care about social values, so on. Okay? So we should be pretty much at home. There'll be a few Jewish bits that don't fit so naturally to us. Okay. So then, Matthew among the Gospels. So, revised and enlarged edition of Mark, supplementing Mark with material from Q, wherever he got it. One of the things he does, he adds an infancy narrative, Christmas story, which Mark didn't have. Okay. He expands the teaching content enormously, and we saw that on one of the charts, comparing the number of sayings in Mark with the number of sayings in Matthew. He either adds or perhaps preserves the ending of the Gospel of Mark, which has been lost. It's another story for another time. It could be that what we find now in the bulk of chapter 28 is what used to be Mark chapter 16. That would make sense if Matthew was an early elaborator, expander, reviser of the Gospel of Mark. But the original ending of Mark is missing. And he gives us a way of telling the Jesus story, a reading of Jesus, which is strongly Jewish. And that's probably the reason why canonically Matthew has always been put first in the Gospels. It's the Gospel which feels most like the Old Testament. So traditionally it's come first. And then Mark, which is kind of baby Matthew, and then Luke, and then John. Okay. And of course, in Matthew, it's very clear to see there are tensions between the Jesus people and the Moses people, between the church and the synagogue. Another thing which is also relevant in terms of timing and dating and so on, Matthew is aware that things can go pear-shaped in the life of the church, and you need to have processes for conflict resolution. Okay, that's Matthew chapter 18. There's nothing like that in any of the other Gospels. So Matthew's been around long enough to realise we need some rules about how we're going to treat each other. We can't just say, oh, we love Jesus, everything will be fine. That's really great, but let's have some rules. Let's have a process here. Okay, so I'll wrap this up because we're pretty much on time. So Matthew is telling a story about Jesus being active in Israel, particularly in Galilee, and it's a story where conflict, disagreement ends up in schism. The followers of Jesus leave the synagogue. And so this next paragraph is saying much the same thing. This was a Jewish Christian community that hoped it could persuade all the rest of the Jews to follow Jesus, and it hasn't worked out. And they're coming to terms with the fact that Paul was right and the future is with the Gentiles. But that's a tough one for these people to adopt. But Matthew is kind of the gospel which is kind of let's get back onto the main road and stop heading off on these tracks. Let's get back onto where the action is. This one I think is really worth reflecting on. There are 5 big chunks of teaching material in Matthew. 5 books of the Torah, whatever. And one of them is, of course, the Sermon on the Mount. Chapter 13 are the collection of parables. Chapter 18 is dealing with conflict in the church and so on. But these big speeches that Jesus gives, you could take them out and the story would go on without missing a beat. In other words, I think this is Lutz has pointed out, those collections of Jesus' material that Matthew has gathered up together, they're for us, they're for the readers. They're not for the characters in the story. They have no connection with the characters in the story. But they're for the readers. This is what Matthew wants the readers to pay attention to. Jesus is not speaking to the characters around him, he's speaking to the person who's reading Matthew's Gospel. I find that a really fascinating idea about what these 5 teaching discourses are about. And they'll be a big part of the stuff we do in church this coming year. We picked this up, I think, already. Matthew's integrated the itinerant prophetic tradition of Q with the story that Mark has about Jesus, the action man, and he's telling a new story for a community that has to decide whether to become extinct or to embrace a different way of being church. Again, that has nothing to do with Grafton Cathedral, right? That's not our problem at all. Do we become extinct or do we embrace a different way of being church? I think that's what Matthew is doing. Now, we won't find the answer to our question in Matthew's Gospel, but it might be reassuring to know that as early as the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, there were people like Matthew saying, you know, what we've been doing for the last 80 years is not working. We're going to have to change stuff around here. And then they started all the jokes about change. How many Anglicans does it take to change a light bulb and so on? Okay, that's actually not true, of course. All right. So we can assume that Matthew basically agrees with Mark. You can't assume that for Luke, by the way, but Matthew basically agrees with Mark. He just wants to edit it a bit, elaborate, correct a few things here and there, make it more relevant to their situation. And we won't have time to unpack these, but these are the major themes that we find in Matthew's Gospel. Just to highlight one, the 3rd one down, righteousness and discipleship. I put in the 2 Greek words, dikaiosune, which means righteousness, and dikaios, which means just, a good guy, okay? Good person. These words occur dozens of times in Matthew and never once in Mark and Luke. Interesting. But they're very Jewish terms. Okay, you've got to do what is right by the rules. You've got to observe the law, the Torah. So Matthew's mindset is coming out of tell me what the rules are and I will keep them. That's righteousness. That's being law-abiding. That's not messing up. Okay? So Matthew does have a very Jewish DNA, yet Matthew is also the person who begins his gospel with the wise men turning up, and the wise men are pagan foreigners. They're not worshippers of God. They don't keep the covenant. They're probably not circumcised. They never told me that in my Christmas story. But these are foreigners who don't keep the law. And they're the only ones in Israel who recognise the birth of the Messiah. Because in Matthew, the shepherds and the angels are actually in Luke's gospel. So for Matthew, the only people who figure it out are the foreigners, the outsiders, the pagans, the astrologers. And at the very end of his gospel, Matthew has Jesus saying, go and make disciples of all nations. Don't just work with the Jews. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them. This is the bit that doesn't sound very Jesus. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Wow, that's a very advanced theological concept for Jesus. Okay? And teaching them to observe everything I have commanded you. I don't tell them the rules. I've got to teach them how to behave. Okay? So we're going to have, hopefully, an interesting year with Matthew. And the final graphic there would just say, point to reflect on as we go away, what would the New Testament be like without Matthew's voice? Yeah, we could get everything we need from Luke. And we could get by with Mark if we had to. Lots of early Christians did. But imagine if there was no Matthew in the Bible. What difference would that make to the way we understand our faith? Okay? Let's leave it there. Unless there's any other last minute questions, but let's we've certainly done our time. Throw money, flowers. Sorry, it's a bit of a rush through some of that stuff, but some of the questions actually teased out things that might have been really